Hi, Huntresses.
Welcome to Talk Rich to Me,
Where we explore the human side of finance. We're your co-hosts, Stephanie Gutman
and Yesenia Rhodes, co-founders of Huntress Wealth. Welcome back, Huntresses. Today we're talking about something that impacts millions of women but rarely gets discussed at work: perimenopause. Stephanie sits down with Rebekah Brown, CEO of Empowder, to discuss the hidden career impact of this life stage and why understanding it matters for your confidence, your career, and ultimately your financial future.
I am here today with Rebekah Brown to talk about menopause and money. Would you mind starting us off with a little bit about yourself and then just little tidbits from your menopause journey?
Thank you for having me. So my name is Rebekah Brown. I am actually by training a researcher. So I'd spent my career up until my own pretty messy perimenopause journey in that field of research, and actually a specific area of research called narrative research, which is basically the collecting of stories and the kind of future trend, looking ahead to what the world is going to hold. And, most importantly, what we as humans want from that world. And I absolutely loved my job. I'd been doing it pretty much since I graduated. I hit my 43rd year. I was by this point running a creative agency, so I'd managed to hustle my way up through the ranks. I broke through what many of us would call the glass ceiling to be running my own business, and I hit what I now know was the menopause wall. And what was particularly tricky, and I think is perhaps true for the people that will be listening to this conversation today, is, first I didn't know what perimenopause was. This was 10 years ago. I hadn't heard it as a term. I think if I had heard about menopause, my assumption was it was something that happened to us maybe in our 50s. It felt like a million miles away. And my association with it was something that probably would result in hot flashes. What I hadn't understood, and I think what we're still learning today, is the psychological impact that perimenopause particularly has on us. So at that point in my life, I was managing a very stressful career. I had young children. I had a father who was terminally ill. So I had a lot of sort of external stresses, I guess, going on at the same time. And over the period of about 6 months, I went from feeling relatively comfortable in my own skin to being absolutely crippled by anxiety. And I basically had a really, really persistent sense of failure. I really wasn't up to the job anymore. I put on a lot of weight, which really impacted my confidence and my sense of self. My hair was falling out. I had hormonal acne. I wasn't sleeping. And I did what women always do. I just decided to push on through. And so the sort of the less capable I felt, the harder I worked. I was getting up at like 4 or 5 a.m. in the morning, preparing for meetings that really, I should have been able to do with my eyes closed. A weekend, I had no joy left in my life. And it got so bad that there were days when, I really felt that the world would be better off without me in it. And that was the point that my husband nudged me into our doctor's surgery, and I really should have gone a lot sooner than that. And I think because I presented myself probably as someone who was depressed, that was the diagnosis I got. There was no conversation about my age. There was no conversation about hormones. There was no conversation about some of the other symptoms that were perhaps being referred to in that conversation. I was just given a prescription. I left that doctor's surgery with a prescription I didn't feel very comfortable with. So I think the other important thing to say to anyone listening to this bleak story is there was a happy ending. And what I also realized was, yes, I had days where I was incredibly, incredibly low. I also had days where I could run a small country. And it was that kind of sort of almost like instinctive recognition that there was some form of roller coaster going on that made me think this is not depression. This is something else that's happening to me biochemically. And that's really where my story of Empowder began.
At what point did you realize that the diagnosis you received wasn't enough?
I didn't even take it. It didn't feel right because I think I left not really feeling listened to. I felt a little bit dismissed. I was told also, to take some time off, and it was almost like you can't have it all. You're a woman with your own business. You've got young kids. You've got an ill father. You probably just aren't coping with the reality of life. That's kind of what it felt like to me.
Yeah.
And I didn't feel depressed. And this is really typical. About 65% of women will be diagnosed with depression before perimenopause is even discussed. And that's still today. And statistically, we will take 3 or 4 appointments with our doctor or MD before they have that conversation with us, which is really worrying, because when you're on your knees, it's very hard to advocate for yourself as well. And I think because I'm a researcher by trade, that was my instinctive thing to do. And I think the other thing that I feel incredibly lucky about is I was running my own company. Like, how many of us had the luxury of saying, I'm just going to stop? Like, I would not have been able to get well if I hadn't stopped. And I probably would have taken the prescription if I didn't know I could stop, because I almost
If
said
you
to
just had
myself,
to get through it, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. So I think that's really important to flag. And I was able to say, I'm just not going to take any new client briefs for 6 months, because that's, kind of how the consultancy industry works. I'd wrapped up a brief. I remember actually my final brief was on the 14th of February. And I delivered it in on Valentine's Day, absolutely broken. And that's when my, journey back to health began. And initially it really was just about what felt like a need to repair my nervous system. But then my brain started cogitating on what did all these symptoms mean. Was there some awful underlying health condition, or was there something else going on? And, the beauty of what I found actually was really liberating, because I learned about this life stage that no one was talking about, but I also learned about the brilliance of female biochemistry. And I think that's the thing that's really exciting, is that we are not taught about this stuff at school. And so we tend to be pathologized in the medical uh, categories, because they're not looking at females as distinct biochemical beings. They're looking at us quite often through the lens of tiny men. And so when we don't behave in that way that's very predictable and not cyclical, because we are essentially cyclical creatures,
Mhm.
it's assumed that something is broken. Whereas actually, when you start looking at perimenopause, it's this huge opening up of opportunity for us as women, if we're supported and if we can find the tools that we need.
Menopause is almost like this point in time. It's this thing, right? Whereas perimenopause is a lot less defined. Can you
Yeah.
talk about what menopause and perimenopause is?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think all of the labels are unhelpful. And you're absolutely right. So perimenopause basically just means before,
Mhm.
before menopause. So very vague. And what we now know is that most females will start that transition from their late 30s or early 40s. Some of us who maybe are as a result of illness, or genetics sometimes, will have it much, much earlier. So if you go through surgical menopause, for example, you will be thrown into that post-menopause period of your life right away. But for those of us that kind of get to that stage naturally, it's our late 30s, early 40s. And unlike I think a lot of the assumptions, it's not necessarily your cycle that changes straight away. We actually now know from both Empowder proprietary data and also broader data that quite often it is the symptoms that I was struggling with. So it's this psychological impact that often begins first, and maybe a change to weight, a change to food intolerances, sleep disturbances. These things often show up quite early in our perimenopause journey. And for many of us, it can last from our late 30s to early 40s right through to our late 40s, early 50s. So an 8 to 12-year transition. And what makes it even more swirly is that there were over 48 symptoms now associated with menopause. And that's because our sex hormones, and estrogen particularly, impact every single cell in our body. So anything from dry eyes to bone ache to hair loss to uh, burning tongue. There are so many symptoms that can be
Burning tongue?
associated. Oh my goodness. I kind of feel like I've got the bingo card, and I got most of them. But yeah, burning tongue is particularly unpleasant. And it genuinely is that. It's that sense that you just want to put ice on your tongue, because it feels like you've had something really, really spicy and you just can't get rid of it. But that's a
Fascinating.
symptom. That is a symptom. Dry eyes, weeping eyes, you get both, breast tenderness, so many things. And it really does, benefit us to kind of have a look at that long list, which we can do from the Menopause Society, or in the UK, the National Menopause Society here. So then when you get to your menopause, you're absolutely right. This is a retrospective date, which makes it particularly unhelpful to us as women, I think, and not that helpful to the medical community either. And it's basically 12 months consecutively without a period or cycle. And if you take into account how many of us may be on birth control, how many of us may have started hormone therapy for our symptoms already, that's a really hard anniversary to even mark in your diary.
Imagining the years of going 3 months without, and it's like, oh,
Yes.
not yet. And it's like going 9 months without, oh, not yet.
Exactly. That's so many women. You'll get to 11 months or 11 and a half months, and then you'll have a period, and you'll just be like, oh, for goodness sake, and then you're back to day one. And then I think the other sort of misconception is that because we've labelled that period afterwards as postmenopause, the assumption is that we come out of postmenopause, and we don't. Postmenopause is effectively the rest of your life. Between 30 and 50% of our lives will be postmenopausal. So it's not something that we kind of get through and then everything goes back to how it was before. It really is this transition phase where it's part two. I find that a much more helpful way to think about it. And it's also the point in your life where you really have the opportunity to determine your health span. And I would argue your joy span as well. So this is really about how women age well. And I think if you start thinking about menopause in that context, one, it's far less scary, but two, it really does highlight how important it is to take action now, to your point, not just from a sort of health and well-being perspective, but financially, what are you going to need in order to navigate that second phase of your life optimally?
I speak with a lot of women in their 30s and 40s who are like reaching this like peak earning feeling, right? Hit
Yeah.
my stride. I know what I'm doing. But we know from pay gap research that motherhood, parenthood is
Yeah.
one major impact on pay gap here in the US. But then menopause is another impact on the
That's
pay
right.
gap. How does this show up and impact the career?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. I kind of referred earlier to what I often talk about as the sort of menopause wall, because we do, as women, often kind of get through that glass ceiling. And this is a sort of pinnacle in our career for many of us in terms of earning potential. Bloomberg has released data around menopause related challenging costing the global economy about 150 billion per year in terms of lost productivity, which is crazy. And then in the US, there's data from the Mayo Clinic that talks about the 1.8 billion, and that's annually lost in work time.
Well, and I'm going to go with unsupported productivity.
It's exactly that. And in the UK, we have stats that point to sort of 1 in 10 women actually leaving work. And I think what's even more telling is that many women stop going for the promotions. So, if you think about my own experience, and you no longer feel up to your job. It's not necessarily documented within sort of HR protocols, but that individual that suddenly stops sort of striving to get to the next point on the career ladder, when up until maybe 6 months ago they were really, really motivated, those should be sort of like warning signs. But unfortunately, we don't have that kind of broad knowledge yet to start spotting for signals that we ourselves as women often aren't aware of either. So we're not necessarily going to have a conversation about it, but we do need other people to almost be sort of watching for us. And the other thing to sort of like highlight is that the systems, like the workplaces themselves, not recognizing, not supporting, and the impact that has materially on the economy and obviously an individual's ability to learn. But you also have the reality that because we're not putting the money into the R&D that would allow us to better understand female biochemistry, we're in this kind of loop. There's some really interesting research from Accenture just at the end of last year actually saying that if we sort of improved women's health participation studies, it would add £1 trillion to the global economy in the next 10 to 15 years. So just
Oh, that's
understanding
all.
us better.
If we
Yeah,
just
that's all. Not worth it. Not worth the investment. But that, and then you think about, so that's kind of R&D and research. And then you think about, well, what about the VC community? Like, who's investing in the innovation that's going to help transform the way that women live their lives? And you look at the tiny fraction of funds that go privately into innovative companies trying to address some of these issues. So it's kind of like almost like every single system that should be there to fully represent both genders. We're always as women sort of battling to be seen and sort of invested in fully.
You had talked about losing confidence. This window is like hit. It really was like a wall for you. And so we hear women talk about like this imposter syndrome. But I think there's this compounding like ageism that creeps in. What do we see from employers towards specifically women who age?
Yeah. What I hadn't realized until I got into this life stage myself and started researching it more fully is the two women that coined the term imposter syndrome were actually women. And also that our propensity for experiencing imposter syndrome increases as we age, which I find fascinating because actually that's counterintuitive. We should become more confident of our wisdom as we become more experienced. But actually, as women, we are disproportionately impacted as we age. Men aren't so much. So I find that really, really interesting. It's almost like we become more aware of what we don't know as we get wiser. There was an interesting piece of research last year from the British Standards Institute, which is kind of the body here in the UK that looks at how companies should run and operate. And they saw a direct correlation with a sort of pernicious sort of ageism associated with females in the workplace, which meant that it exacerbated any feelings of loss of confidence and also the lack of support that would be there for them in the workplace as they age. And obviously, the implications for a female not in the workplace during her menopause transition and beyond is catastrophic for her as an individual, but it has this kind of filter down impact on the women that will follow. And so what we also know is that, we talk a lot about diversity and inclusion in the boardroom and how much more powerful workplaces are when there's women present as well as men, and diversity in terms of cultural and perspectives that people can bring collectively. But what we sometimes forget, I think, is when that woman leaves the boardroom because she doesn't feel supported, she doesn't feel able to do her job, the women that are coming through that front door can't see a path to their own succession. They can't see a woman in her late 40s, early 50s thriving. And so that has huge implications, I think, for what they see their own ceiling as being. And that's really what we need to think about. I think what women are really, really good at, because we come into the world as other. We learn very, very early on that most of the systems are not built for us. Primarily. And that means we lean very heavily on other women. So, it's if you've been pregnant, it will often be that person who's a little bit ahead of you that will tell you the stories or will give you the reassurance. And I always describe that within the Empowder community as almost like, we light the fires that others will follow. And it was really important that women can have safe spaces to talk about their own experience, particularly when the systems aren't there providing that data for them. It's almost like we, through our narrative histories, are able to tell the stories that help each other navigate and find a route to resolution. I think the other thing to flag is that we do pathologize females' life stages. And actually what we also know from a research perspective is that women are phenomenal as they age. You do not want to lose that human from your workplace. As they go through menopause, what we don't talk enough about is we become more purpose-driven. So we really want to leave a legacy. There's some beautiful data about the fact that we become more empathetic as we age as women. So we go through menopause and we're better able to conflict resolve. We're better able to understand someone else's point of view. All of these things are so important to the culture and the kind of forward trajectory of businesses and society as a whole. And the other thing is we talk a lot about cognitive function decline, but actually females in midlife, the grey matter in their brain grows, which I love because that's kind of where the wisdom goes. So there's so much to say for women. We're also much, much more likely to be entrepreneurial, which I find fascinating as well. I don't know if it's in part because we become more confident in our voice as we transition through menopause, and therefore we go and try and solve for the things that we feel the world is missing, or whether it's just that confidence piece overall. But if you look at the data around an older woman starting a business, she's much more likely to succeed. So this really is a time when women can step into this huge sort of life stage full of liberation and potential.
Emphasizing this very uncertain feeling before you necessarily know what's going on. The mom group chat is lit up with is it not sleeping for 3 nights straight because of the kids, or is it perimenopause? I work for a narcissistic boss, or is it perimenopause? The faster we can help women feel secure and knowledgeable about what's happening, I think the quicker it is for her to embrace those benefits, right? And that's true at work too.
To your point around those WhatsApp groups we've all been in, I mean, what I love about them is that the word just is always in there. So is it just? And it's like, don't say just. It's really horrible. You don't need to say just. And also it kind of doesn't matter. I think we as a generation, perhaps when we're having had children later, but also we live in a world with unprecedented stress as a norm. And what we've seen is perimenopause and menopause in the medical community, it's a biochemical stressor. So it's an internal inflammatory state that our body goes through as part of this transition. But we also know our hormones are significantly impacted by what's going on in the outside world, which is, very true for me as well. So if you're looking at your life and you've got small children and you're juggling career and you're juggling life and it doesn't really matter whether you are statistically likely to be in perimenopause or whether your hormones are fluctuating as a result of external stress. The protocols would be exactly the same. They may not lead to medication, but we'd really want to be thinking about, well, how do you balance cortisol? How do you digest stress? What are you putting on your plate? How do you supplement well? How do you reclaim rest, even if you can't reclaim a full night, sleep in bed because of little people waking you up? Those things are really, really important, I think, for us to embrace, because the more you become aware of this hormone orchestra, the better able you are to sort of respond to the little signals it gives you before it screams. And those then are so valuable as you head into perimenopause in earnest. And as I say, it doesn't matter. There's never too early a time to start, because all of the things you'll learn about for perimenopause, if you learn about them earlier, they're really helpful in periods of stress and anxiety as well. And so that was the thing I'd really advocate for. You and I spoke before this conversation about the concept of the peri-prepper, which I love as a term, which researchers are now using, because we really should be having these conversations in our 20s and early 30s, because then it's not a daunting transition. It's just another part of our evolution that makes us even more phenomenal as we age.
I know you had talked about the notion of like everybody goes through this, right? And in some ways in the medical community that can lead, that's part of the dismissiveness, is like, this isn't a medical event because it happens to everyone, right? Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, and I think again, it's fascinating, isn't it? Because 51% of the population go through this transition. Not everybody is able or chooses to have a child, and when you look at the investment in both research and training of the medical community around birth and fertility compared to that menopause, it's woefully disproportionate in terms of the support we get. And I think it's also, if you look at puberty and the empathy with which we bring our view of puberty to the world, partly because we all experience it as both genders, but I think there's far greater understanding of that hormone roller coaster that is effectively what we have in reverse, and over a much longer period when we go into postmenopause. We'd never dismiss a teenager who was confused and angry and stressed and struggling with skin and hair and weight and their role in the world. We
Wait, are
wouldn't
you
do
just
that.
describing me?
But we just wouldn't do that. And I think to make, just because something is part of a natural transition doesn't mean that the symptoms should be ignored and not supported, particularly when we're not taught about this biochemical stage. I do feel like we need the support tools, because the reality is with doctors, they go in and they receive training, and in the UK they get less than 4 hours on menopause, and in the US it's basically about the same. And even with gynecologists, where in the US you would expect a far greater understanding of female biochemistry, many of those syllabuses, I think only 20%, the last time it was sort of evaluated, 20% of the gynecological courses covered menopause as a topic, which is just crazy. So what that means is they're not there to cause us harm, but I feel very passionately we should be talking about menopause within longevity as a sort of a concept, because what we do know is that sort of assumption that it's just something you get through and it's a period that ends, and that previous generations haven't needed that kind of support. All of that, one, isn't true, but two, we know that when we go through menopause, our risk of cardiovascular disease increases significantly, our risk of diabetes increases, our risk of osteoporosis increases. So it's not like, yes, it's natural, but that very significant decline in terms of sex hormones has an implication for our long-term health. And we have tools and interventions that can mitigate that. So it's like, why wouldn't we?
Yeah. So let's talk about that. Let's dive in. So first, before we get into like the details of tools to help manage and support through this stage, what should a 35 to 45-year-old know? Like,
Yes, our peri-preppers. So I would say that you need to look at your biochemistry with awe, rather than fear, and realize that this hormone orchestra that you are uniquely born with, which has over 100 different instruments in, when 3 or 4 of those instruments, which effectively are sex hormones, our estrogen, our progesterone, our testosterone, when they go out of tune, it impacts everything. And that sound isn't so great. And so quite often I think we are taught to look at menopause, especially when we're younger, as something that just affects your sex hormones. But actually, it's going to affect your cortisol. It's going to affect your serotonin. It's going to affect your gut microbiota. If you can start a conversation early as a woman in her late 20s, early 30s, to just understand more about that hormone orchestra and start spotting the signals in your cycle already and what you know works for you, you're in a much better position when perimenopause arrives. And I think the other thing that younger women should be very cognizant of is you need an MD who's going to be your friend, who you can have an open conversation with quite early, really, about your cycle, your questions, how you're digesting stress now, because we know that people who perhaps have had a diagnosis of depression earlier in their lives, that may return. But there's other conversations you'd want to have, your medical history, your comfort with the concept of hormone therapy. If you're worried about it, please have a conversation with a doctor who's got up-to-date data, because it's incredibly helpful for the vast majority of us if that's a route you choose. But I think what's really valuable is when you have those conversations early, what you don't want is the experience I had when you sort of arrive at the doctor's surgery on your knees and you meet a doctor who hasn't had the necessary training. And so they're not able to spot the signals and you're not necessarily informed either, or you are. And what we increasingly see now in the US and the UK is women who are very well informed arriving at their doctor's practice and asking for hormone therapy and being told they're too young when they're not, or being told they're too old when they're not. So, if you can start that conversation early and you know that you've got a really good MD that you trust, then I think that's probably one of the biggest things you can do for yourself.
I'm just like, put it on my to-do list, doctor shop.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting, especially in the US, under most health plans, you can like pick your doctor, right? And I originally stopped going to my OBGYN when I was like firmly out of the child or birthing years. I was like, I'm done.
Yeah.
I'm good. I'm good with my, GP kind of taking over. And I'm sitting here thinking like, I don't know if that was the best choice, but at the same time, my OBGYN, who was wonderful for, conceiving and pregnancy, and postpartum, not like, I don't think it's in their practice area to cover menopause, right? And I do think my GP, who is a DO, which is slightly more like holistic degree here in the States, I do think she's like better equipped for like this conversation. But this notion of like what's worked for you so far might not be the best fit going forward through this transition. And
that's
like,
a really good point.
Just because they've been wonderful and trustworthy and helped you with these things, like the idea of like doctor shopping, like preparing for this like phase of a change, right? And making sure you're best supported. I want to go like interview some doctors and be like, tell me about
Do it. Yeah. I think it's so valuable to do because many of them now are getting additional training. They're making it their own mission. We work with some wonderful doctors in the US as Empowder, and what I love also is the humility that we have as women, because we're learning about our biochemistry. But the best doctors recognize that science doesn't stand still, and that they need to continue to learn and explore and be curious in the same that we are, to best serve their patients. And there are some phenomenal doctors out there doing phenomenal things. But I think, like you say, do the doctor shop, validate your sort of choice early, because then when you do really need them, you know that you're with someone who's up to date with the latest insights as well.
It's interesting. Like I started going to that OB when I wanted to have children. Like they're very well branded of like, we do this. And it's interesting now I want to go look and see if there's any OBs that are like, we do menopause, right? And if there's,
there are,
and you are an OB, go specialize. You will have lots of women.
Oh my goodness. And also there are some ones now saying this is a distinct requirement, and there's complexity and depth of knowledge that's required in terms of administering hormone therapy, which doesn't behave like an antibiotic. I think that's the other thing we need to be aware of, is if you do choose to go down that route, which many of us will be able to, it's not something that's kind of fixed in a couple of weeks in the way that perhaps taking something for a sore throat or a rash maybe, and that requires again a relationship with your MD where you don't feel uncomfortable about going back and saying, I I just don't feel right, or I feel a bit like, because there's
Yeah.
so much again that they can do. It's not a
Knobs you have
single protocol.
to
Yeah,
turn, right?
exactly.
Totally. Okay, so you've mentioned HRT. We've talked some about supplements. And what are kind of like, what is the suite of tools to help through this phase?
Yeah, there are so many, and I think that's what's exciting. And also, it's different for each of us, right? We have this unique biochemistry, and we have to, I think, first and foremost, treat our bodies with kindness at this life stage, and then curiosity. Those are the two things I would say would be the sort of foundations of navigating this life stage well, and expecting the tools that you put into your toolbox to change. So if I think about my early perimenopause to where I am now in my early 50s, with completely different requirements, now I'm postmenopause, what served me then doesn't necessarily serve me now. But if I was to prioritize where to begin as a perimenopausal individual, I would say the first thing to really think about is how you digest stress.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you're not looking at the way that you cope with stress, all of the other interventions we talk about just don't work as well. And what's fascinating from a research point of view is we touched on earlier the fact that menopause is in fact an inflammatory state. So our body's going through a biochemical stress experience, and then at the same time we're responding quite often to a world that's stressful just because of the life stage we're at and all of the other things that tend to happen around the same point in our lives. But what we also now know from a research point of view is it's not in our heads that we become less resilient to stress. So many women will say, I can't believe I got so upset about that thing. I never get upset about those things, but I lost my temper with my child, or I snipped at my work colleague, and I'm not that person. And actually what the research shows is that because of our cortisol and the way that our hormones are playing, we genuinely become less resilient. It's not something that we think is in our head. It's actually biochemically true that we will respond to stress very differently in those perimenopause periods when we are struggling with that hormone imbalance. So learning how to digest it better. And there are many interventions that until relatively recently, perhaps the Western world thought were just placebos or, woo, that we're actually beginning to see have real potential and valid scientific research to support them in terms of the impact on our parasympathetic nervous systems, emotional freedom technique, breath work, mindfulness, journaling, cognitive behavioral therapy, all fabulous. There's a strain of cognitive behavioral therapy called CBTI, specifically for insomnia. And that kind of would bring me to my next pillar of health, which is not necessarily sleep, but rest. And I think the really important thing for us to become aware of is those top 10 hygiene tips for getting to sleep. They don't work in midlife, and they're really frustrating because we will have put the phone outside, we would have stopped doom scrolling, we would have had our bath, we would have taken our magnesium, and we still can't sleep. And the reason for that is our circadian rhythm quite often shifts in midlife, and also the hormone fluctuations will mean that we may wake. It might be a hot flash, it may be a cortisol surge at 3 a.m. where your brain lights up and you can't go back to sleep. Yeah. And so working to understand what does work, I think, is incredibly helpful. And one of the most significant things I've learned over the 4 or 5 years of interviewing experts in sleep is it's about being far kinder to yourself. So rather than that fear where you're looking at your clock, if you don't go back to sleep after about 20 minutes of being awake, that advice to just stay in your bed and close your eyes is not as effective for us as getting up, making a gentle herbal brew, sitting somewhere really quiet. Don't do anything active like the ironing, but just go and sit, read, rest, and sleep is much more likely to come back to you if you do that. So that's, I think, something that's really helpful for women struggling with sleep. And then the second thing is almost recognizing how far you've come as a human. You have done days when you're tired. You are not going to collapse, on the subway. You're not going to crash your car into the back of someone else's. You are going to be able to get through that meeting. It's not going to feel pleasant, but you can. And then you need to think about rest, because that's very distinct from sleep. So look to Yoga Nidra, where there's some really interesting research around its ability to deliver deep rest and parasympathetic relief to our bodies. Lie down. I say it's a radical act. Lie down for 40 minutes in the afternoon if you're tired, because that helps.
What I love about none of this has to wait for menopause.
No.
And I live in the world of like money, and I'm like, if you're scared of dealing with your money, deal with it before this phase, because it's only going to get scarier, right?
Yes.
And this like foundation of I'm okay, what's the worst that can happen? It's just like knowing what's going on with your money takes, because if you do make career decisions in this phase, if you do strike out and start a company, if you do step back, right? Like there's not right or wrong answers. It's just like this takes money. Like
Yeah.
you
Yeah, it does. Yeah, exactly. I think that's really important as well. And, you know, it is an opportunity to open that Pandora's box. What makes you happy?
yeah.
What's your purpose? What brings you joy?
Yeah.
All of those questions I think are really helpful. We are at a midlife point and it's almost an invitation. It can feel swirly and tricky, but often it's I think your life kind of tapping you on the shoulder and saying, okay, we've got another 40-50% to go. Where next? I'm so thrilled that we are involving females much, much younger in these conversations now, because it's a beautiful journey that we go through.
So we've talked about a lot of
Mm.
different support structures, and all of this just goes down to like how you are building and researching within communities.
Yeah, I mean, thank you. I think the thing that struck me as I went through my own messy journey and the founding of Empowder was the wisdom that women carry in their bones. We talked earlier about this concept of us navigating the world together, which I think women do so beautifully and so instinctively we don't even realize that that's what we're doing.
Mhm.
And what I found when I started researching how other people were coping with menopause 10 years ago was they had some amazing advice for me. And what I've really believed strongly is that if we can harness that wisdom, that lived experience that women hold, that narrative research, which is my background, with the latest science, and we pull that together, the thing that is missing in the female health space is the female voice. We've created an ecosystem that creates products and programs with and for her. And so around 38% of our customers in the UK will track their symptoms when they're on a formulation with us. But way before that, we are able to look at the symptom data that pretty much every female, when they arrive at our ecosystem, will share with us. All of that narrative insight goes into the formulations and the programs that we develop. And in the US, it's enabled us to create an Empowder method. We know that a product in a pot is never going to be enough
Mhm.
for a female navigating this life stage. It's such a unique life experience. You need that wraparound holistic care. And that's what we look to do with our ecosystem and with women and the individuals. So we're signposting out to the sources we trust. We're really validating the doctors that we collaborate with. We run monthly masterclasses on the topics you tell us interest you most. And I think, globally, we're going to change this life stage only by doing it together. We kind of need everyone in the tent. And that's what Empowered is setting out to do.
I love that. Okay. The time has come for the final two questions. What is one piece of advice you have for all the huntresses out there?
I would say, well, my one piece of advice, I mean, I know this is a financial focused, beautiful podcast that I adore, but my one piece of advice actually would be around falling back in love with your biochemistry. I think we can get so cross with our bodies and minds. We feel betrayed. But actually, what I've learned through years of studying this as a life stage now is our bodies are designed to transition, and actually, they always have your best interests at heart. And if you can listen to the symptoms and the signals when it's whispered in your ear, it won't need to scream. And that I think is such a beautiful thing to recognize in us, because this is not about a decline. This is about stepping up rather than fading away.
Definitely. Okay. And Rebecca, what does rich mean to you?
For me, I feel incredibly privileged that rich for me is rich in purpose. And I, again, look back on my own, very difficult few years of perimenopause. So I don't think we should it's not all unicorns and rainbows, although I'm an optimist at heart. If I hadn't gone through that experience as a woman with a very different career ambition, I was building an agency, I was consulting, it was all about, day rates and hours and project scale. Now for me, it's about the feedback we get. If I can make an impact to one woman in terms of helping to signpost something, or maybe it's a woman's daughter, increasingly it's older women now recommending Empowder to their daughters who are heading into that peri-prepping phase.
Mhm.
That for me has been absolutely game changing. So I think the thing I didn't realize as an entrepreneur working in a traditional category was that it doesn't have to be lonely. But when you're working as a community, as an ecosystem, I'm just the curator. I have the privilege of holding the space, but every single female voice is making this transition and this opportunity evolve as a business and a community. And that's really lovely, not to be doing it on my own.
No, it's beautiful. Well, thank you so much, Rebekah.
Thank you.
Go make your TV appointment.
Thank you.
Rebekah's going to be on TV today.
I'm very nervous, so I'm basically I'm going to go sit on the train and try and channel my inner huntress.
Do it. We've been saying serving hunt.
Oh, I love that.
Go embrace your purpose. Go own it.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Talk Rich to Me, a production from Huntress Wealth. For more chill takes on finance, sign up for our newsletter at huntresswealth.com. That's HUNTRESSWEALTH.com.